This is Jack Moelmann, and we have really an exciting interview, I think, tonight with a truly outstanding person, not even somebody from the United States. I'll mention his name in a minute, but it's July 3rd, 2012. It's almost 12 midnight. It's about 20 after 11. We're at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott as part of the 2012 American Theater Organ Society Annual Convention. And we just got back from a couple great concerts, and I managed to find this wonderful gentleman who's from Australia. Name is Tony. I'm sorry.
That's it.
Tony, we're not going to start over. Tony Fenelon, who is a master at both the organ, the piano, and probably the record player as well. But he's a great musician, comes over here periodically, and we're just going to see what he has to say. Welcome, Tony.
Thank you very much, Jack.
Now, how did you first get started in music, and maybe even tell your age?
Well, I got started probably when I was about 3 because my dad used to play the piano when I was a little kid. He played essentially by ear, and he used to just amuse himself and play in that old style, you know, with the stride piano, the tenths in the left hand and everything like that. And I guess that at that age I really tried to imitate him because my mum used to put the chair up against the piano, and I just amused myself playing things like that. And apparently, according to what everybody tells me, I was pretty good at mimicking stuff that Dad did, you know, only on a simple basis, of course. But I suppose what actually really helped me, Jack, was the fact that my grandmother had a player piano. And I spent a lot of time over at my grandmother's place. And I used to go out to the back room where they had this sort of cabinet along under the window, and I used to open those doors, and in that cabinet were all these player rolls. And I used to grab armfuls of them and take them into the front room where the player piano was and thread them up and sit there. I could barely reach the pedals to pump the air. But what I would do, I would listen to the music, and then I would stop pedaling, and the notes would stay down. As you know, you could do it by slowing it down.
Sure.
And I'd put my hands in where the notes were depressed, and I'd wait until the air exhausted, and then I would play the notes, and I'd say, oh, you know, is that how you play that chord? And I must have, and training the ear to sort of link it with what I saw and what I felt on the keyboards. And it was funny, you know, because I learned so many songs by listening to player rolls.
And player rolls have a lot more fingers put down, require more fingers.
You said it, you know, and quite early on I worked out that each little line on the roll represented a finger. And one day I'm sitting there and I thought, why can't I sound like that? And I started counting. I was in 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, hang on a minute, you know. I was only quite young. And I asked my cousin, he used to play the rolls, he was the one that bought them. He was a lot older than me. Gee, when I was 5 or 6, he would have been 18 or 19. But he used to sit there and play the rolls and sing because they had the words down the side.
Oh, you know? Sure.
And I asked him, I said, how come there's more holes in the rolls? He said, oh, they do it over and over again, meaning they overdubbed.
Sure, they sit there with an ice pick and make their own arrangements.
They do, and they fix up the mistakes too, because apparently on the original, when they cut them, it's not actually cutting a hole in the roll, it's just marking it with...
Okay, and then they punch them later.
Yeah, they do that on the machine later, and they can fix up all the errors. That's why these guys played so well, you know.
Well, so how did we get into the organ?
Well, that came not that long after that. You see, my dad had a friend, that they were friends since their teenage days, you know. His name was Jeff Avery, and Jeff bought an old Wurlitzer organ from a theatre in Melbourne called the Majestic. Now this was a photo player console with a roll player on it, and it was only about 4 ranks. I think it may have been diapason, string, flute and vox humana, and that's it, with percussions like glockenspiel and xylophone and a few odds and ends. Sure. From the kitchenware department. But what Jeffo did, he bricked off half the lounge room, the front room of the house, enough to put all the pipes and stuff in the back, and he put the shutters in the intervening wall, and the console was planned to go against the wall on the outside. Now, of course, this was a photo player console, you couldn't play it. And so I remember, and I was only very small, but I remember the day we went down to his house out in the back shed. He was an engineer, a brilliant engineer. And I remember the day he'd scribed out the horseshoe on this panel. And Dad said, "What are you doing, Jeffo?" He said, "Oh, I'm building a console, a replica console." So he built this console, a lookalike to a Wurlitzer console. There was only 2 manuals at the time, and he later expanded it to 3. And a very curious thing, he made the notes a little narrower than normal because Jeffo couldn't stretch an octave very easily. So he made the keyboards just a fraction smaller. And I always wondered why this keyboard felt different from my piano at home.
That's why.
That's why. And I was fascinated. Jeff would sit there. He was a master of counter melodies. And he used to listen to Ken Griffin records, you know, the old Ken Griffin Hammond records. Jeff was, although it was a Wurlitzer organ, he was very keen on the Hammond principle. And so, being an engineer, he decided he'd make one. And he turned all these tone wheels on a milling machine. He made a complete set of Hammond tone wheels.
Really?
Yep. And instead of having a gear train to drive them all, he'd have these little pulleys on the shafts, and he calculated the diameter of each pulley, and he had this belt that sort of figure S all the way through the things and then back.
This thing worked?
It worked. It actually worked. It was quite amazing. And he had drawbars. He even manufactured the drawbars, and they looked just like Hammond drawbars.
I'll be darned.
He had this. He could play it from the top keyboard on the Wurlitzer.
Well, now, did you take lessons from somebody, piano, organ?
I took lessons from piano, yeah. When I was about 6 years old, my dad took me to a very famous teacher in Melbourne whom he knew through his work as an accountant, oddly enough.
Now, he didn't teach you on the player piano.
Oh, no, that wasn't done at all. We had an old Beale piano, which was pretty cranky. It was a rotten old piano. And anyway, Dad took me in to see this music teacher, and we used to visit him, you know, at odd times. Dad used just to take me in there to let this teacher, Roy Shepherd, hear what I was doing off my own bat, you know. And Roy said, well, we've got to, he suggested we go to a preliminary teacher, which was a lady not far from us. And so I was with her for maybe 2 or 3 years. And I progressed pretty well with her, although I hated practicing.
Don't we all?
Yeah. I suppose the first real boost, Jack, came when I actually won a competition, a little suburban piano competition that was held, and I still have somewhere at home a little gold plaque on it with a little, you know, like a little banner with the name engraved on it. And I think the prize in that particular time of my career was £10. I mean, that was big money back in the would have been in the late 40s.
And then you took organ lessons somewhere.
Well, I didn't ever take organ lessons.
Well, I never did either.
No. Well, you see.
How do we survive?
Oh, I think it's a little bit of...
I used to watch the organist play, and you figure out the mechanics of pushing the buttons and listen.
That's right. No, but the hardest part, Jack, is this independence between your feet and your left hand.
Yeah.
Because I found when I was playing at Jeffo's place, everything my left hand did, my feet tried to do, and vice versa. And Jeff said, no, he said, you've got to complete the chord in your left hand. You don't double up, you don't play the bass note, and you've got to practice doing the pa business. And then he got into this counter melody business. He was really great on doing counter melodies. And he used to say, never paint out the melody. He said, always support it. And he taught me how the counter melody, the melody itself and the pedals actually formed a chord. You never doubled up on parts. And so whenever the parts are all independent, like you had a C in the pedal, maybe you have an E in the counter melody and you have a G on the melody line, it actually formed a chord. And the other notes filled in on the offbeats. It always sounded a lot more tuneful, a lot more musical. Anyway, the other thing that happened at Jeffers Place, after they got sick of playing the organ, they'd get records out, and of course that was the first time I heard all those old hi-fi records with George Wright on them.
Oh yes.
They were mono, but things like Crazy Rondo, where George did all this trick recording, you know, the Rondo alla Turca, and Dancing Tambourine, and all the ones that have since been released on Banda. But those records were very famous because every hi-fi shop in Melbourne worth its salt had hi-fi records, George Wright records. It was the way you showed off your hi-fi system.
That's what made the organ popular back in those days.
Too right, yes. And I got bitten by this, and I will never forget the first time my dad took me to the pictures to the theatre, and it was the Regent Theatre Melbourne. And we went in there and this console came up, and I couldn't believe this. Not only was the sight of this guy, this multi-keyboard monster.
Yeah, where did it come from?
Where did it come from? And also the sound, the all-enveloping sound in that theatre. And never did I ever dream that would be the theatre that I would become the resident organist in.
Well,
in
let's
the 60s.
let's talk about this, in particular the organ, because you're very much talented, very well talented in the piano, but let's deal with the organ primarily. What is probably the most spectacular thing that you ever did? I mean, the one performance that stands out of everything that you did. You could talk in terms of either the venue, the organ, the audience, whatever. What do you think? Or maybe you've had more than one, but
I've had more than one, but I do remember one, and it's rather topical because we've just been there tonight. Back in 1984, Lynn Larson and I did a concert at the Pasadena Civic Auditorium on the Moller, and they actually managed to acquire a 9'6" white grand piano, and we did duo stuff at that concert, and we played solos on the Moller, of course. That was probably the biggest organ I'd ever played up till then, and that was a highlight. I really remember that was a thrilling concert. And other thrilling ones on a similar level was ones that I've done at Jasper San Filippo's on that big 5-manual instrument there in that wonderful room. You've been there, I guess.
something else.
Yes, but look, there've been some highlights, and oddly enough, I think one of them was at Rochester back 34 years ago, or even more than that. I think in 1969 I did my first concert at the Auditorium Theatre in Rochester, and that was a beautiful theatre, and ambience, and it was amazing that the audience, it was packed. The whole place was packed. In those days.
In those days, it was packed.
Yeah, it was right.
Well, let's try the extreme here. What would be an example of a program that was just, it was a disaster. You hope you never have to do anything like that again.
Well, I can remember that. I did a lot of work for the electronic organ companies I started off in the 60s with Thomas organs. I actually bought a Thomas Celebrity, which Jack Malmston and Byron Melcher were the designers.
Yeah, that was a popular model.
Oh, it was a beauty instrument. That had 9 tibias on the 9 footages of tibias on the solo, the grape, the upper, the top manual. Yes, after that I did a lot of freelancing. I wasn't contracted with any other brand for quite a while until about 1976, which was Lowry, but I did a fair bit of work for Con organs at the time, and there was the Con 653 and the 652, 651, and the 2 manual ones, the 642 and 643. And they were great instruments. They were, very theatrical. They weren't orchestral. They were essentially a theatre organ. Anyway, I was due to play an organ on a Con 652, I think it was. And we were going to do it in an auditorium at one of the universities in Melbourne. And 2 dealers were involved in this. And I just accepted the engagement and turned up at this place. I found the car park and parked my car and walked over to the auditorium. And I'm looking for people, because this was about 7:15 in the evening. And there are a few people around, but they didn't seem, organ type people. Anyway, I finally found this auditorium, and one of the dealers was there, and he looked pretty crestfallen. And I said, "Where is everyone?" He said, "Well," he said, "we have a slight problem here." He said, "I thought what's his name was doing the advertising, and he thought I was doing the advertising." And they had a little sign up outside, and 3 people turned up to this thing, Jack. 3 people. And we were supposed to be running it 2 nights. Well, you know how you feel like disappearing down a hole. These poor 3 people, whom I knew, were sitting out in the audience. And, 2 of them I knew, one was a stranger. And they'd come quite a distance for this thing.
So did you play the whole program?
We did about an hour and a half. And I said, "Look, you don't want to sit down there. Let's find some seats, bring them up on stage, and you fire some of your favourite songs at me, and I'll play them for you, and we'll go and we'll all have a cup of coffee later on, and that's it." And I said to the dealer, I said, "If you think I'm turning up here tomorrow night," but it was a terrible feeling. It was terrible.
Let's try something else here. You've played a lot of places. We're talking Oregon now.
Yeah.
Where is some place in the world that you haven't played, that you really want to play, for whatever reason, be it public or private? Just to say that you played there, something you aspired to as a challenge, or for whatever reason, some place that you really want to play, that you haven't.
I haven't yet.
Yes.
Atlanta Fox.
Okay.
But you see, that could be on the cards for
You think that's for next year?
Yes.
Have you been invited?
I guess I can say yes.
But you've never played there?
Never played there. I've heard recordings of it. A very exciting instrument. Absolutely exciting.
Well, it really is.
Yes. And actually I've done concerts on classical organs, and because the Melbourne Town Hall organ, which was a Hill, Norman and Beard English organ, was recently, when I say recently, in the last 12 years, totally rebuilt. They stripped the whole thing out and sent it across to the United States to Chant's organ builders, and the instrument has been transformed totally and completely. And I always had an ambition to play the new improved model, because they've now, the old console was up in the casework, right in amongst the pipes virtually facing, but the new console it's all digitally controlled, of course, and the new console is movable, and you can take it down below the stage if you wish. And I got my ambition to play that on July the 4th, about 4 years ago. What a thrilling experience that was. A classical concert organ with the most amazing sound,
Well, you're a marvelous pianist as well. If you had the choice of playing the organ or the piano at a particular event, do you go for one or the other, or you just sort of treat them equal?
I treat them equal, because with the organ, particularly the modern organs, and indeed the pipe organs now that have the computer systems like Uniflex on them, and the Z-Tronics, or we call it Z-Tronics relay, where you can actually do a performance on the organ and record it, such that when you play it back, it's almost the same as you sitting at the console. The only difference is the notes aren't moving, but it's sending all the appropriate signals to all the different chests.
Electronic player piano.
Yeah, that's right. Except it does everything that you would have done at the console, including swell settings, the stop changes, the registration, expression, bloopers. Everything's there. So what I love doing is laying down, like accompaniment tracks or orchestral backing tracks, and playing piano with it. I get a great thrill out of that, and I've done that a tremendous amount at the Nethercote Foundation at San Silmar.
It saves you having to hire the other person.
Oh, in a way, but I have to say, Jack, the concerts I've done with Lynn Larson over the years have been fantastic. And also my very long life friend John Atwell, at least I've known John since about 1971, he and I have done duo concerts in many places, including the United States. We did a tour here in 1995 together, and we had some wonderful venues.
Well, listen, what would be your advice to, we're always trying to get young people involved in this thing, both technicians and performers and all. What would be your message from your experience to young people of how to approach the music, how to get them interested in it? You know, a little pep talk. What would you have to say to somebody that happens to accidentally find this recording?
I see. Well, I would say I've got a couple of recommendations. You've got a wonderful, talented guy in the States, Nathan Avakian, who really has moved outside the square as far as theatre organ playing is concerned. And tonight, Mark Herman played. He's young. I mean, I treat him as a kid, you know. And here he is, emulating all the greats in theatre organ with also infusing his own inimitable style on his playing. Take a little bit of inspiration from these young guys who can play these magnificent instruments. Get away from the phone texting and the Xbox and all the stuff that you stare at a television all day and do something creative. And if you're going to learn, spend a bit of time studying on piano, because you find that if you do that, your technique will be superior. It strengthens the fingers, it gives you discipline, and when you get onto an organ, you'll be able to do amazing things on the keyboard.
Well, it's very good. We want to sort of bring this to a close. I've always admired Tony Fenelon. I haven't met you that many times, but you're a fascinating guy, a terrific musician, and it's always a pleasure to see you over here in the U.S. You're going to be performing and have performed at this convention here in Los Angeles. So I guess you have a final thing you want to say, and then I'll do the signing off here.
Well, I'd say always strive for something new. And I think the thing with theatre organ concerts is that what we've noticed in Australia that's making them a lot more successful is to incorporate them with other artists that are not necessarily organists. I recently did a piano and organ duo concert with Thomas Hayward, who's a classical organist, but using the Wurlitzer. So we did stuff by Bach, Handel, Vivaldi. We got out of the sort of the run-of-the-mill theatre stuff and put a whole new, refreshing mood to it. And at that same theatre a few months before, we had a jazz band, a modern jazz band with a guitarist, double bass, a drummer, and a saxophonist, like a little combo group. And we combined the Wurlitzer, and it hadn't been done before, and it was a fantastic, refreshing concert, mixing it with other things. After all, it's called a unit orchestra, Jack. Let's combine it with some other soloists as well.
Well, I did a concert one time with a banjo.
Well, there you go.
You know,
it's interesting.
Anything goes. Well, anyway, I thank you, Tony, for taking some time out to meet with us. This is July 3rd, almost midnight. We're at the Los Angeles Airport Marriott Hotel as part of the ATOS convention. And Jack Moelmann here, and thank you very much, Tony.
Yeah, it's been my pleasure, Jack. Thanks.